There is a moment I still think about. A woman sat across from me, 61 years old, hands folded in her lap, very still. She had driven 2 hours to get to that appointment. And the first thing she said wasn't hello. It was, "I think I've ruined my son's life by loving him too much." She hadn't slept properly in 3 years. Her son was 36. He was employed. He had a wife, 2 kids, a mortgage. By every external measure, he was fine, and she was falling apart. Every time he didn't call, she convinced herself something was wrong. Every time he made a decision she disagreed with, she felt it in her chest, like a physical blow. Every argument he had with his wife became her argument. Every difficulty he faced became her failure. She wasn't grieving, she wasn't ill, she was suffering chronically, quietly, completely for a grown adult who had no idea the weight his mother was carrying on his behalf. And what I told her that afternoon changed something in both of us. What I'm going to share with you today is not comfortable. I want to be honest about that up front. If you stay with me through this, you're going to understand why the suffering you feel for your adult children, the worry that wakes you at 3 a.m., the stomach drop when you see their name on your phone, the way their bad days become your bad days, why that suffering is not what you think it is. And more than that, you're going to understand what's actually happening in your brain at this stage of life, why this pattern exists, and what it costs you and them when it goes unexamined. This is not a video about loving your children less. It's about understanding what's been quietly happening inside you for decades and what becomes possible when you finally see it clearly. Stay until the end. The most important part comes last. I've been a clinical psychologist for over 20 years. I work with anxiety, depression, and the emotional patterns that shape people's lives, often patterns they've been living inside for so long they've stopped noticing them entirely. A significant part of my work has involved women in their late 50s and 60s. And what I've observed consistently across hundreds of cases is that this particular stage of life produces a very specific kind of pain that women often describe as love, pain that the people around them often validate as love, pain that on the surface looks exactly like love. But when you look at what it actually does to the woman experiencing it and to the children it's directed at, it tells a different story. The woman who drove 2 hours to see me that day wasn't unusual. She was, in many ways, exactly what the culture had asked her to be: devoted, self-sacrificing, present, responsible. What the culture hadn't prepared her for was what happens when the children grow up and the devotion has nowhere to go. What happens when the sacrifice becomes a habit with no object? What happens when you've spent 30 years defining yourself through someone else's life and that someone else has, quite reasonably, gone off to live it? That's where the suffering starts, and that's where this conversation begins. Her name was Margaret, 61 years old, son named Daniel, 36. She described their relationship as close. They spoke 3 or 4 times a week. She knew his schedule, his moods, the state of his marriage. When I asked her how she felt after those phone calls, she paused for a long moment. "Exhausted," she said, "but I'd feel worse if we didn't talk." That sentence is worth sitting with. She wasn't calling Daniel because the calls gave her energy or joy. She was calling and needed him to call her because the alternative felt worse. The anxiety of not knowing was more unbearable than the exhaustion of constant contact. So she managed the anxiety the only way that seemed to work, by staying close, by staying informed, by staying needed. I asked her when Daniel had last come to her with a real problem. Something serious, something where he genuinely needed her perspective. She thought about it for almost a full minute. "A few years ago," she said, "maybe more." But she could tell me in precise detail about every difficulty he'd faced in the past 18 months. His job stress, a disagreement with a neighbour, a week when his youngest wasn't sleeping well and the whole household was fraying at the edges, she knew all of it. Daniel hadn't told her most of it directly. She'd pieced it together. From things he mentioned in passing, from what his wife had said, from the tone of his voice when he answered the phone. She was doing the emotional labor of being inside a life she wasn't living. And here's what I told her. What she was experiencing had a specific structure. It wasn't random worry. It was a system one her brain had built, reinforced, and made automatic over 3 decades of active mothering. The system made perfect sense when Daniel was 7. It makes a different kind of sense now, but her brain hadn't updated the program. That was the beginning of the conversation, but what came next, what she told me in the 3rd session, changed my understanding of what was really driving all of it. I see this pattern regularly enough that I've stopped being surprised by it, but the first time a client names it out loud, there's always a moment of genuine shock, their own. Margaret came to our 3rd session quieter than usual. She'd been doing something I'd asked her to try, keeping a brief log, not of Daniel's problems, of her own internal state, before and after any contact with him, calls, texts, visits. She put the notebook on the table between us and didn't say anything for a moment. I think I've been using him, she said finally. I don't mean intentionally, but I think that's what it looks like. What the log had shown her was this. Her anxiety spiked in the hours before she expected to hear from him. When she called him and he didn't answer, the anxiety intensified until he responded. When they spoke and everything was fine, there was a brief period of relief, sometimes 20 minutes, sometimes an hour, and then it started building again. She was, in the clearest functional sense, managing her own emotional state through him. Now, this is important because I see the instinct to immediately reassure. Of course you worry, you're his mother. That's what mothers do. And that's true. Maternal concern is real. The neurological connection between a mother and her children is real, documented, and deep. But there's a specific threshold where concern becomes something else. Research in attachment theory, particularly the work built on John Bowlby's foundational framework and extended by researchers like Mario Mikulincer and Philip Shaver, shows that adult anxious attachment doesn't only affect romantic relationships, it operates in parent-child bonds too, and it operates in both directions. A parent with unresolved anxiety can become as emotionally dependent on the child as an anxiously attached partner in a relationship. The child, in this dynamic, becomes a regulatory object. Their well-being becomes the mother's primary mechanism for managing her own nervous system. And the worst part, the part that Margaret hadn't seen until she looked at the notebook, is that this system requires the child to remain somewhat in difficulty. A fully thriving, completely independent, needs nothing adult child is destabilizing to this system. Because if he doesn't need her, what regulates her? Margaret sat very still when I said that. That's not love, she said quietly. That's not what I meant it to be. But here's what she still didn't know. The part that explains where this actually comes from and why it almost always gets worse around 60. What happens in a woman's brain at this stage of life is something that doesn't get nearly enough attention, and I think it explains more about the suffering pattern than anything else I've encountered. For roughly 30 years from the time a child is born through the years of active parenting, the maternal brain operates under a sustained neurological and hormonal load. The prefrontal cortex, which governs long-term reasoning and identity, shares cognitive resources with the limbic system, which drives attachment, protection, and emotional response. During active parenting, the scales tilt heavily toward the limbic, toward vigilance, toward others. This is adaptive. It's what the situation demands. But around the late 50s and early 60s, something shifts. The hormonal architecture changes. The sustained demands of active caregiving reduce. And for the first time in decades, there's neurological space, genuine biological capacity for the prefrontal cortex to ask a question it's barely had room for. Who am I outside of this role? For many women, this question doesn't feel like an opportunity. It feels like a crisis because they don't have an answer ready. The identity that was built through 30 years of active mothering doesn't have a natural successor. The sense of purpose that came from being needed doesn't automatically transfer. And so the brain does something predictable. It holds on. It finds ways to maintain the state it knows how to inhabit. It looks for evidence that the children still need protection. It amplifies worry. It tightens the grip, not out of malice, but because the alternative feels like standing in a room with no floor. Margaret's suffering at 61 wasn't evidence that something was wrong with her love for her son. It was evidence that her brain was in the middle of a transition it hadn't been given a map for. The suffering was filling a space, the space where her own self was supposed to be. And the question that changes everything, the one I asked her to sit with between sessions, wasn't about Daniel at all. Let me be specific about what this costs, because I think vague reassurances don't help here. When a mother in her 60s is chronically anxious about her adult children's lives, the physiological effects are measurable. Elevated cortisol over sustained periods affects immune function, sleep architecture, cardiovascular health, and cognitive sharpness. The body doesn't distinguish between a real threat and an imagined one. It responds to worry the same way it responds to danger. And decades of chronic low-level anxiety leave a biological mark. That's the cost to her. The cost to the child is subtler but equally real. Children, even adult children, are exquisitely sensitive to their parents' emotional state. When a mother projects chronic anxiety onto her adult child's circumstances, the child receives an implicit message. Your life is not safe. Your choices are worrying. You are not fully capable of handling what's in front of you. Some children respond to this by pulling away. Distance becomes a form of self-protection. The calls get shorter, the visits less frequent, and the mother interprets the distance as rejection, which increases her anxiety, which increases the pressure, which increases the distance. The loop closes on itself. Other children respond by absorbing the anxiety. They begin editing what they share with their mother, not because they don't trust her, but because they've learned that sharing their difficulties with her creates more weight, not less. She doesn't help them carry the problem. She becomes part of it. Margaret, when I described this to her, went very quiet. He edits himself, she said. I've noticed it for years. I thought it was just him growing up, getting more private. It wasn't just that he'd learnt the way children learn without words, through experience, that his mother's well-being was partly contingent on his, and so he'd started protecting her from the real shape of his life, from the difficulties that would cost her sleep, from the honest conversations they might have had. What she'd thought was closeness, the calls, the knowledge of his daily life, the sense that they were deeply connected, had actually become a curated performance. He was managing her gently, with love, but managing her nonetheless. And neither of them had ever said a word about it. But there was one more layer, the one that took Margaret the longest to look at, because it was about her, only her, and had nothing to do with Daniel at all. I asked Margaret, in our 5th session, to tell me about what she'd wanted for herself before she was a mother, before she was a wife. What had been hers alone? She was quiet for a long time. I wanted to write, she said. I was good at it. I had a journal I kept from when I was 17 until I was 28, and then I stopped. Why? There wasn't time. There was always something more important. I asked her when she'd last written anything, even privately. She couldn't remember. This is not unusual. In fact, it's one of the most consistent threads I see across cases like hers. The suffering pattern, the chronic anxiety directed outward at the adult children, often functions as a very effective way of not having to answer a question that feels far more frightening than Daniel's job stress or his marriage or his neighbour dispute. What is my life for now? Worry is, among other things, a remarkable distractor. It keeps the mind occupied. It provides a sense of purpose, the purpose of concern, the purpose of vigilance, the purpose of being someone who cares so much they can't sleep. It is a way of being needed when the direct need is no longer there. And the harder truth is this: at some level, the suffering maintains the role. If I am devastated by my son's difficulties, I am still central to them. I am still his mother in the most active, consuming sense of the word. The suffering is a way of staying connected to a version of myself that knows who she is. Letting go of the suffering means something more than it appears to mean. It means being willing to stand in that room with no floor and find out whether there's actually ground beneath it. What I told Margaret then is what I want to say to you now. There is ground, but you have to be willing to stop holding onto the walls long enough to find out. The question I get asked at this point is always some version of, fine, but what do I actually do? And I want to be careful here, because I think there's a version of this conversation that offers tidy steps and makes change sound cleaner than it is. So let me be honest about what this actually looks like. The first thing, and it's unglamorous, is noticing. Before any behavioural change is possible, you have to be able to see the pattern clearly enough to recognise when you're inside it. Margaret's log was useful precisely because it made the invisible visible. She could see in her own handwriting the shape of her anxiety cycle. So the first practice is simply this: the next time you feel the pull to call, to check, to search for evidence about how your child is doing, pause, not to suppress the impulse, but to observe it. Ask yourself, what am I actually feeling right now before I pick up the phone? What am I hoping to find? What am I afraid of finding? The feelings underneath that impulse are worth knowing. They're almost never really about the child. The second thing is harder. It requires confronting what I described earlier, the identity question. And I don't mean sitting with it abstractly. I mean taking it seriously enough to act on it. What did you want before you were a mother? What's been waiting? What's the thing you've been telling yourself you'll get to someday, when things settle, when everyone is okay? Here's what I know from working with women in their 60s. The neurological window for this kind of reinvention is real, but it is not infinite. The brain retains remarkable plasticity at this age, more than most people realise. The drop in certain hormonal pressures actually creates a clarity that many women describe as the clearest thinking of their lives. That's not a metaphor. That's biology working in your favour. But the window does not stay open by staying unused. Margaret started writing again at 62. She told me she was bad at it at first, stiff, self-conscious, like using a muscle that had gone unused for 30 years, which is, of course, exactly what it was. By the time we ended our work together, she was writing regularly. Daniel knew about it. He'd read some of it. And something interesting had happened in their relationship, something she hadn't engineered or strategized toward. He'd started calling her differently. The calls were different in content. He wasn't just updating her on logistics or managing her anxiety. He was asking her things about her work, about what she was thinking, about whether she'd considered publishing any of it. One afternoon, she told me, he'd called for no particular reason, just to talk. He said, and she repeated this to me with a steadiness that told me she'd already absorbed it enough times to hold it without falling apart. I feel like I'm getting to know you again, Mum. Like, there's more of you than I realised. That's not a small thing. What changed in their relationship wasn't that Margaret became less loving, it was that she became more present to her own life. And in becoming present to her own life, she stopped making Daniel responsible for filling the space inside it. She stopped needing his well-being in order to feel okay. And because she stopped needing it, she stopped pulling on it. And because she stopped pulling on it, he stopped bracing against the pull. What remained when all of that tension released was something both of them recognized, even if they didn't have clinical language for it. A real relationship between two adults, with actual curiosity moving in both directions. I'm not going to tell you this happens in every case. It doesn't. I've sat with women whose adult children remain distant, regardless of what shifted in the mother. I've sat with women for whom the letting go felt like pure loss, at least for a long time. But here is what I will tell you with certainty. The suffering pattern, the chronic consuming anxiety directed at an adult child's life never improves the relationship. In 20 years of practice, I have not seen a single case where a mother's chronic suffering made her adult child's life better or their relationship closer. It costs her health, it costs them ease, and it costs the relationship whatever honesty might otherwise exist between them. The work of this stage of life is not more sacrifice, it's a different kind of courage entirely. What happens in families when this pattern is broken is something that extends beyond the individual relationship. The children of women who do this work, who go through the difficulty of building a self outside the maternal role, tend to parent differently, not because their mothers told them to, because they grew up watching someone demonstrate that it was possible to love fully without losing yourself entirely in the loving. That's not a lesson you can teach in words. It passes through example or it doesn't pass at all. There are also effects the other direction. I've seen adult children become more genuinely present with their mothers once the dynamic shifts. The son who used to call perfunctorily from obligation begins calling differently from something closer to actual interest, because he's no longer managing her, he's just talking to her. Margaret's son asking whether she'd considered publishing wasn't a reward for her doing the psychological work. It was simply what happens when one person in a relationship stops requiring the other to perform a role. You find out who they actually are. And sometimes, often enough, in my experience, you find out you like them. The last thing I want to say is this. The suffering you feel for your children is real. The love underneath it is real. I'm not asking you to doubt either of those things. What I'm asking is whether the suffering is actually serving them or serving a version of yourself that was built for a different chapter of your life and hasn't been updated. Because the most important thing you can offer an adult child is not your worry. It's the evidence, demonstrated daily, that a full life at 60, 70, 80 is possible, that the years ahead hold something worth being present for. Your children are watching. They always were. The pattern underneath everything I've described today is this. Chronic maternal suffering in later life is almost always doing two jobs simultaneously. It looks like love directed outward. And it is love, genuinely. But it's also serving an internal function, filling a space, maintaining an identity, managing a fear. Seeing that clearly is the beginning of being able to choose differently. Margaret, the last time I saw her, had a kind of settledness I hadn't seen in her when we started. She was still Daniel's mother. She's still worried sometimes that doesn't disappear entirely, and it isn't supposed to. But the worry had a different texture. It wasn't running her. She told me something I've thought about since. I think I thought letting go meant not caring, but it's more like I finally have enough ground under my own feet that I can actually reach out to him properly. Before I was always grabbing. Now I'm just here. If something in this has landed for you, if you recognize this pattern in yourself or in someone you love, I want you to leave the word present in the comments below. Just that word. It's a marker for where you are right now and where you might be going. And if you know a woman who is in the middle of this, whose children are grown, and whose suffering is quiet and constant and invisible, share this with her. This conversation should be happening far more than it is. The years after 60 are not the footnote to the story. For the women who do this work, they're often the most honest chapter yet.